Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
Just to recap, we're in the middle of a 5-episode series about integrated SEL instruction. Another way of saying that is weaving SEL into our academic instruction throughout the day. And during these episodes, we're going grade band by grade band and talking through many examples of activities for SEL integration. By listening to this 5-episode series, you're hopefully picking up some activity ideas for your classroom, which is always nice. But also by listening to these, you're hopefully learning just more about the Minnesota SEL standards themselves. And they're the foundation of everything we do with SEL. If we're doing it right, pretty much everything we're doing across the whole school day is supporting kiddos in meeting those SEL standards. So to preview where we're going this week, so far, we've covered self-awareness and self-management. This week, we're looking at the third standards area, social awareness. And social awareness is kind of like our radar system. It's skills like empathy and perspective taking, recognizing how other people feel and what they might be thinking, learning to appreciate and celebrate diverse backgrounds and cultures, understanding appropriate social behavior like, hey, I can play keep away with my brother during a backyard picnic, but not during a wedding reception. That may or may not, connect to something that happened in Nick's childhood. It also means recognizing sources of support for different kinds of problems, like building up our own personal Angie's list.
But before that, let's talk about what's filling our bucket this week. I am going to say just a general, what's filling my bucket is just that it's Friday. It's been a long week, and I'm just looking for some time to kind of recuperate from the week and get ahead on some things that have fell behind this week at home. So what about you, Nick?
Very relatable, Rye. What's filling my bucket is my dog, Mila. Love her to death. She's the light of our lives, and great self-care puppy cuddles.
So cute. Well, my bucket is being filled by being at Saga Lakes Primary School today. I get to help support in a classroom, and I also got a fresh haircut on Tuesday, so I'm just loving it. Life is great.
You're looking great today, Court.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's too bad we're not filming the podcast anymore, so people can't appreciate that. But
you guys are so kind. Okay, let's shift to our main topic. So what is integrated SEL instruction? It's kind of like the counterpart of explicit SEL instruction. It's important to set aside time to teach SEL skills directly, and you can use a curriculum like Second Step or our Be Good People curriculum to do that. That's explicit SEL instruction. We can also weave this teaching throughout the school day, making it part of every content area. So that's what we mean when we're saying integrated SEL instruction. And these aren't competing practices. They're both super important.
And let's also briefly talk about what this actually concretely looks like in practice. So some of these activity examples we're going to go through fit nicely into a lesson plan. So you could, for example, add an SEL learning target or an SEL focus to the top of an academic lesson plan, and then identify how the SEL standards are going to be supported during that lesson. And some of the activities we're going to cover in the episode won't fit that model quite so well. So like an example, in episode 14, when we talked about self-awareness, one of the examples was, encouraging kids to join clubs or other activities. And I can't see myself really writing that into a math lesson plan, for example. It doesn't exactly fit that model. So some will and some won't fit that exact model we described. But this might sound kooky to you if you're new to this idea. And FYI, we are including a few example lesson plans in the show notes so you can see what this looks like and demystify it a little bit.
And we also want to mention that the example activities that we're talking about today come straight from the Minnesota State SEL standards. Our state standards include a bunch of integration examples, so schools don't have to come up with any of this from scratch.
So we're going to get started, and we're going to run through these examples by grade band, starting with K through 3. So if you don't teach K through 3, I would suggest that you look at the time codes in your podcast app and skip ahead. So starting with K through 3, our first benchmark is identify a range of emotional expressions in others by either facial expression or tone of voice. An activity for this is during classroom read aloud, stop periodically to ask students what a character is feeling and how the picture helps them to know this. Nick kind of mentioned something similar to this in the last podcast when you talked about a narwhal and a polar bear.
And I made up that story, by the way, so, cut me in if anybody listens to this and decides to write an actual book about the polar bear and the narwhal.
No. Yeah, I think you were talking about the narwhal or the polar bear shouting at one another. But here you could ask just, how did the narwhal feel when the polar bear shouted at him? How do you know that? What did the polar bear look like? Just stopping and reflecting on some of those stories or pictures or even videos that you show in your classroom can help identify some of those emotions.
The next benchmark is to identify and execute responsibilities that contribute to their classroom. So give students classroom jobs and have discussions about how they are helpful to the group. So I think this could work for really any part of the day or any subject area. Maybe someone is the book distributor or the paper collector. Giving them those jobs not only takes some simple things off of your plate, but it can make them feel like contributing members of the class. And then you can talk about how they were helpful and what that looked like.
This makes me feel old because in elementary school, one of my jobs sometimes was to run outside with the chalk erasers and hit them together to get the chalk out of them. And it doesn't really happen that much anymore.
I used to remember taking the attendance down to the office, but now everything's electronic, so we don't have to do that. But that was my favorite.
The next benchmark we're going to talk about is identify how the students can help others. For example, like feeding the dog or sharing or cleaning up when asked. And one example of how to weave this in is asking students to create an art project or write a simple writing assignment about how they help others every day or every week. And students need to practice their writing skills, right? Obviously, we need subject matter for art projects. So this is just a great, simple way to integrate social emotional learning when we're doing those things we're already doing, practicing writing and doing art projects. And I think this is also an example to get our gears rotating in our heads of how explicit and integrated instruction can work together. On the explicit side, the second step curriculum, in their kindergarten progression, they have a lesson on caring and helping, and our Be Good People curriculum has a lesson on offering help. So if I'm just, for example, an elementary teacher, and I know that we're teaching one of those lessons in, say, week 11 in November, I might plan to have a writing assignment or an art project that week that ties into that idea of helping others. And it's just nice, we teach that, spend some time dedicated to that skill, and then we weave it into other areas throughout the day. So there can be some really nice enrichment and building on concepts that way.
The next one is recognizing that others may experience situations differently from them. An activity for this is have students play agree or disagree, where they go to different areas of the room if they agree or disagree with statements such as, I like playing sports. Then have them explain their answers. I just love that idea for an activity because it's such a great way to incorporate learning, movement into learning, as well as learning so much from your students and from each other.
Yeah, and really demonstrating my encyclopedic knowledge of podcast episodes, I'm pretty sure we covered the 3 signature SEL practices in episode 2, and we mostly focused in that episode on ways this could be used with adults, but I know that this is an example of a welcoming inclusion activity that you could definitely use with early elementary students to open any kind of lesson and just open it up, welcome students, and get them ready to learn.
Yeah, so fun.
So shifting to the 4 through 5 grade band, the first benchmark that we're going to highlight is identify how their behavior, students' behavior, affects the emotions of others. And an example activity is have students analyze how characters' behaviors affect others as part of an after reading reflection activity. So we're reading literature text. This is an easy thing to weave in. It could be a journal assignment. It could be a long answer question that you add to a worksheet. And it might sound like, say, you're reading Charlotte's Web, and when Wilbur did X, Y, and Z, how do you think it made Charlotte feel? And if you familiarized your students with the Yale mood meter or the zones of regulation or an emotions vocab wheel, there's so many examples of those kind of emotion visuals. You can lean on that and encourage kids to reference it whenever they're answering a question like this. Emotion is so central to the human experience, and like we've said before, giving kids more emotional vocabulary, it not only helps them have more emotional intelligence, but it also makes them better writers. So we don't want students, writing, it made Charlotte very sad forever. when there are such great vocab words they can learn, like discouraged or disappointed, for example.
The next benchmark is demonstrate respect for others' perspectives and point of views. So an activity for this is to discuss how characters in a story show respect for others. It's funny that Nick brought up Charlotte's Web because that was going to be my example too. So during another lesson about Charlotte's Web, you could ask the class how Charlotte demonstrated respect for all of the animals on the farm.
It's really funny because I didn't know that was your example, but I Googled 4 through 5 texts. And the first one, I didn't read Hatchet in school, but the first one I opened up was Hatchet, and Hatchet is a individual survival story. And I was like, how am I going to come up with examples of a character's behavior affecting other characters' emotions when it's literally about one person surviving on their own?
Right.
So bad luck.
That was my exact train of thought as well. So way to go. Great minds think
Same
alike.
page. Okay. Next benchmark we're going to talk about is define and recognize examples of stereotyping, discrimination, and prejudice. A great way to weave this in is celebrating historical figures and characters who resisted stereotypes or worked to promote justice and equality for others. And I loved history and social studies class so much growing up. So apologies in general if I'm biased about that sometimes. But examples of this, when you're learning about, say, Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr., those are prime times to talk about why they did what they did, why it was important then, and then how it's important now. And obviously, our national dialogue around issues of race, ethnicity, equity, it's exploded in the last couple years. And this is certainly a big example of where equity, SEL, and social studies all overlap and intersect with each other.
The next one, recognize qualities of positive peer and adult role models. Activity is to ask students to respond to a journal prompt or write an essay about traits of role models. I think this age group of kids just look up to so many kinds of role models and adults that they're interested in or work with. Last year, my daughter had a project for her reading and writing class where they had to research a person, and many of them picked role models like famous athletes or people who have made a difference throughout history. But they called it a wax museum, so all the kids came to school dressed like their person and gave information to parents, teachers, and other classmates about why they picked them and what they did that made a difference, that made them a positive role model to others.
That is such a cute and great example, Rye, as always.
I love it.
It was really neat. Some of the kids got really creative, and it was just fun to see some of that, their personality shine through what they picked. So, of course, Paige picked Misty Copeland, of course, a ballerina. So fitting.
We're shifting to our middle school kiddos, 6th through 8th grade band, and the first benchmark we're going to talk about is summarize another person's point of view. And an activity example would be having students debate an academic issue, and during that process, practice summarizing another classmate's point of view. And this is such an important skill set, perspective taking. We practiced when I was growing up debates in class, and we still did it in grad school, actually. And it's an engaging pedagogical strategy that has elements of project-based learning because it allows kids to work in teams, have different roles, exercise autonomy with how they prepare for the debate. There's so many benefits. But yeah, as the facilitator of the debate, you as the teacher, you can pause and plan to prompt students with like, hey, okay, take a minute and summarize what Team B just said. And that picture I just painted was pretty formal example. But when differences of opinion naturally occur in whole group discussion, spontaneously, kids raise their hand or don't and just interject those differences of opinion. We've all been there. You can facilitate that informal debate. So you could say like, okay, Ryan, could you try to summarize where Sarah is coming from? And the Minnesota SEL standards even give an example of doing this with math problems, for example.
Another one, predict others' feelings and perspectives in a variety of situations. An activity for this, students write alternate endings to stories by changing the behavior of one character. You guys talked earlier about Charlotte's Web, but think of how different that story could look from maybe Charlotte's perspective or one of the other animals in the barn.
Another example is explain how decisions and behaviors of individuals affect the well-being of schools or communities. So an activity for this would be to have students draw an impact web of how their actions could potentially affect others, or how a historical figure's actions affected society. So Nick already brought up Martin Luther King, and I think that would be just a great one to draw a web of how his actions during the civil rights movement in the 60s really impacted where we are at today.
I love that example. So visual and engaging.
It's a good one.
The next benchmark we're going to talk about is recognize how similarities and differences in cultural norms and social cues affect the way that people interact. And we haven't mentioned that the Minnesota SEL standards, not only do they feature example activities like the ones we've been talking about, but they also have a column of related academic standards. And in this case, I think I can just read those academic standards, and they're going to paint a pretty great picture of how this SEL standard intersects with ELA. So for a 7th grade example, analyze how an author develops and contrasts the points of view of different characters or narrators in a text, including those from diverse cultures. So just by doing the worksheets and discussion to meet that ELA standard, when we have a text that features diverse cultures, there's so much that you can do to facilitate and support learning for that SEL standard. They're just so tightly linked together. And then the 8th grade example, analyze a case in which 2 or more texts, including one text by or about Minnesota American Indians or other diverse cultures, provide conflicting information on the same topic. Identify where the texts disagree on matters of fact or interpretation. So again, the ELA standards in this case have so much intersection with that SEL standard that we are really doing 2 things at once almost when we're reading those texts and discussing them. So we are going to shift to our high schoolers, grade band 9 through 12. And the first benchmark we're talking about here is ask questions of others to deepen understanding of the perspective of others. And an example activity would be organize and encourage projects as part of ELA and social studies or history that explore different cultures and celebrate diversity. And that's a pretty blank canvas, right? What I just read. They list multiple subject areas. You might encounter another culture in a literature text. You are definitely going to be discussing various cultures in history class. And what the SEL standard is getting at here, I think, is really perspective taking. And that's absolutely a transferable skill that your kids are going to take with them into life and the workplace. Culture is a big part of that perspective taking. And I so clearly remember a time when I was learning about Japanese history in history class, and the teacher made a connection to anime, which I happen to know many middle school and high school kids are particularly passionate about anime these days. And we watched part of an anime movie and had a discussion around the nuclear bombings and how that affected the Japanese culture and the art that people created in Japan in the decades after World War II. So a great way to explore the perspective of a particular culture and how they would view something different than you might if you weren't part of that culture. And that's just one example. Again, there's so many options with how to do this.
Definitely room to get creative. The next one is compare multiple perspectives on an issue. This activity is to hold formal debates about different local issues. I just thinking back and reflecting on my high school experience, some of my favorite memories of my high school classes were in my 9th grade civics class where we did just this. We held debates and mock trials of certain issues and current events. And I just remember learning so much about my teachers and the students and my peers in the class. And I just remember that activity so vividly, and it can have such an impact.
The next benchmark is to differentiate between the factual and emotional content of what a person says. So using literature or current events, discuss how emotions may point to what's true for them, or perspective versus factual as objectively true. Consider events when objectively true may not be valid. So I made current events a huge part of almost all of the classes I taught when I was back in the classroom. This activity could be used when sharing a current event that you bring in as a teacher. You can have the students dissect the article and separate into those categories, what was true for the author versus what is just factually accurate.
Okay, so the last benchmark we're going to chat about for our high schoolers is evaluate strategies for recognizing and opposing stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination among individuals, institutions, and social structures. And an example activity for this is not so much a single activity, it's just pointing specifically to the social studies curriculum resource, Facing History and Ourselves. And if you haven't heard of that, let me explain. Facing History and Ourselves is a website, and we're going to link to it in the show notes, don't worry. And it has discussion guides and lesson plans, 4,693 of them to be exact, in a sortable, searchable database. So you can sort by topic, search for specific terms, right? And you can always leverage those. So say to supplement a social studies curriculum that you're already using. But one thing we really wanted to highlight, because it's been very topical lately in the last couple of months, is they have a special page for current events. So after the death of George Floyd last spring, and after the insurrection at the US Capitol, for example, they very quickly published discussion guides to help teachers thoughtfully explore those issues with a historical lens. So that's a great resource, and again, we'll link to that in the show notes. All right, so let's talk takeaways. So to recap, we focused on social awareness during this episode, and social awareness is like our radar system. It's for looking outward, and that means skills like empathy and perspective taking. It means learning to appreciate and celebrate diverse backgrounds and cultures. It means understanding appropriate social behavior, so what's acceptable and what's not in different situations. And it also means recognizing sources of support for different kinds of problems we have. And we teach these skills during our explicit SEL instruction, but there are also so many opportunities to weave this learning in throughout the school day. And please stay tuned for next week's episode. We're going to be covering relationship skills.
One of my favorites. So thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks guys. Bye.